The coffee hit her left shoulder before she could step back. Not scolding, not cold, just warm enough to feel deliberate. It spread across the dark charcoal of her blazer in a shape that had no name, but that everyone present would remember. A dark arc the size of a man's open hand, moving from the point of impact toward her collar in the unhurried way that liquids move when no one is stopping them. Victor Hale's voice followed it the way thunder follows lightning, low and theatrical, and aimed not at her, not really, but at the 4 people standing 2 feet behind him in the white marble atrium of the Hale Vertex Tower. He had calibrated the volume precisely loud enough to carry to the elevator bank, quiet enough to preserve the fiction of restraint. "Try to be useful for once," he said. A pause. He straightened his cuff with 2 fingers. "And don't look at me like that." He did not explain what look she was giving him. He did not need to. The instruction was not about her face. It was about the audience. The 4 Westgate Capitol representatives shifted their weight. 2 of them looked at the marble floor, the particular marble that had been sourced from a quarry outside Florence and cost the company $340 per square foot, according to the building materials report Elena had read 3 years ago when it was filed as a capital expenditure in the Q2 documentation. One investor examined his phone with sudden interest. Only Margot Sinclair, silver-haired and standing at the back of the group with her leather notepad open in the crook of her arm, looked at the receptionist. She held her gaze there for a long beat, unhurried, the way a person looks at something when they are filing it away rather than reacting to it. Then she opened the notepad and wrote a single word. She did not share it with anyone in the room. She did not need to. Elena Voss did not move. She stood behind the reception desk with the coffee spreading its dark arc across her left shoulder and her hands flat on the desk surface, the same position she had been in when the cup tipped, and her face arranged into something that was not patience and not anger and not the careful blankness of a person suppressing either. It was something older than all 3 of those things, something settled. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of feeling, but the absolute mastery of where feeling goes. Silence. A long beat followed. This is the story of what happens when a man who mistakes a uniform for a ceiling discovers very late and in a room full of witnesses that the ceiling was never there. If you have ever stood in a room and been looked through, as if you were furniture rather than a person, as if the years you had put into something counted for nothing simply because no one in authority had thought to count them, subscribe to this channel right now and leave 1 word in the comments. Invisible. Just that single word. You will understand by the time this story ends exactly why that word is the right one and not any other word. Subscribe now, and then come back because what happens next is the kind of thing that does not announce itself until the moment it is already done. 3 days before the board meeting. 3 days before the room on the 47th floor changed temperature without anyone touching the thermostat. 3 days before the name WRN Holdings, LLC appeared on a document in front of Victor Hale, and he read it twice, then a 3rd time, more slowly than the first 2. The way people read things they cannot immediately make fit inside the story they have been telling themselves. 3 days before everything. The morning had started like every other morning on the 42nd floor of the Hale Vertex Tower, which is to say it had started the way every morning started when Victor Hale was present with performance. Victor Hale performed his authority the way certain men perform authority when they have spent enough years confusing it with theater that the distinction has stopped mattering to them. He did not manage from his office. Managing from an office was, in his view, the posture of a man who did not trust himself to be seen in motion. He moved through the floors instead, in deliberate arcs, pausing at the desks of people who needed to feel noticed by him, asking the right questions in the right register, loud enough to carry across the open plan, controlled enough to read as effortless rather than calculated. He was, in this narrow sense, genuinely skilled. He understood rooms. He understood the way status moved through a group of people, the way heat moves through a conductor, always from the warmer body toward the cooler one, always without asking permission. He had been doing this for 4 years, and he had gotten better at it every year. The Atrium Tour was the flagship performance. He reserved it for investors, board candidates, and anyone whose impression of Hale Vertex he was attempting to shape before they had time to form one independently and without his narration. He had given the tour 11 times in 4 years, and it had evolved the way a piece of theater evolves through a long run. The gestures were sharper, the timing was tighter, the pauses landed with more precision. He had a line about the atrium's glass facade that he delivered at the same angle each time, turning slightly so the light from the south-facing windows found his face in the way he preferred. "We built the culture before we built the square footage," he would say, with the easy confidence of a man offering a fact. The space followed the values. It was not true. The atrium had been here when he arrived. James Wren's architect had designed it in 2014 as part of the original build-out, a full 5 years before Victor Hale had any connection to this company. Victor had quietly reframed the design credits in the materials the PR team sent to press and to visiting partners, and no one had corrected the record because the person who might most naturally have corrected it, the architect herself, had been among the 15 terminated in his first month. The 4 Westgate Capital representatives moved in his wake through the lobby, attentive and professionally pleasant in the way of people who are being given something and are not yet sure what it will cost them. They were evaluating a $200 million follow-on commitment to the company's Series D extension, and Victor knew it, and they knew he knew it, and the politeness between all parties had the particular character of politeness that functions less like warmth and more like a contract. Useful until someone decides to press on one of its terms. Margot Sinclair walked slightly apart from the group. She had said almost nothing since arriving at 9 in the morning, other than the necessary courtesies at the entrance and a single-pointed question about the vendor contract structure in the company's technology division that Victor had answered smoothly and moved away from quickly. He had filed her silence as a negotiating posture. Experienced investors, he had found, deployed silence as a kind of pressure. He was wrong about this interpretation. It was something else entirely. Elena Voss was at the reception desk when the group moved through the lobby. She was always at the reception desk. 8 years at the same post, the same high-back chair, the same surface that she had learned, the way you learn a place you have inhabited long enough to know its grain. The desk was arranged the way she always arranged it, visitor log open at the current day's page, badge printer warmed and ready, 3 pens in the ceramic holder at the angle she had determined worked equally for right-handed and left-handed visitors. It was a small thing, invisible to anyone who was not paying the kind of attention she paid to everything. No one had ever mentioned it, which is the nature of the thing she did. Victor had set his coffee cup on the edge of her desk 22 minutes earlier, during a brief exchange about a visitor clearance he needed expedited through the system for the Westgate Group's arrival. He had set it down while he talked, and had not taken it back when he finished because that was the kind of man he was with cups in rooms where someone else would deal with them. The pen was Elena's. A weighted brass barrel, a good one, the kind of pen you keep because you have decided to keep it. It rolled left when she shifted her notepad to reach the keyboard during a routine entry, a small motion, ordinary, the kind that happens 100 times a day at a reception desk. Her elbow caught the desk edge as she leaned, the coffee cup tipped. The liquid moved across her shoulder and down the blazer sleeve, and the sound it made against the fabric was small, intimate almost, barely audible in the height of the marble lobby. What followed was not small. Victor Hale stopped, mid-sentence, mid-gesture, with one hand extended toward the atrium's north wall. He looked at his jacket. He looked at the half-dollar-sized mark on the left lapel of a suit that had cost, at the price point he purchased at, approximately $4,800, which was, as it happened, slightly more than Elena's monthly take-home before taxes. He looked at Elena, he looked at the investors behind him, at Margot Sinclair with her notepad, at the weight of their attention arranged around this moment. And then he looked at the second cup, a smaller one, espresso-sized, that had been sitting beside the first on the desk edge, and he reached down and picked it up with a deliberateness that precluded the interpretation of accident, and turned and tipped what remained in it, a thin, dark quarter-inch, onto Elena's left shoulder, precise, unhurried. The gesture of a man who has thought about what he is doing and decided to do it anyway. At Hale Vertex, he said to the investors, to the atrium, to the lobby that carried sound with the clarity of a concert hall, we do not tolerate sloppiness in anyone. Two investors looked away, finding something urgent in the direction of the revolving doors. One studied the floor, the beautiful, expensive floor. Only Margot Sinclair held her gaze on Elena, and her pen was already moving in the notepad. Theo Bauer had been standing by the elevator bank since 9:45, as was his practice when high-value visitors were in the building. He went very still, not the stillness of a man startled by something unexpected, the stillness of a man who has been waiting for something to finally be this explicit, this undeniable, this documented by the sheer number of people present. He would remember where he was standing and what he had seen, and he would never need to be asked to repeat it. Diana Reyes was crossing the lobby with her clipboard when it happened. She stopped walking. She watched the sequence of it, from the tipped cup to the second cup to the sentence, and she said nothing and did not move, but her clipboard rose to her chest and she held it there with both hands, the small protective gesture of a person who needs something solid to hold, while processing something they will not be able to unsee. Elena reached under the desk without looking down, the motion entirely practiced, the kind of reach you make when you know the geography of a surface the way you know your own hands. She produced a folded paper towel, the kind kept in the small drawer at the lower left for spills. She pressed it to her shoulder. She looked at Diana, not at Victor, not at the investors, at Diana, and said quietly at a register the investors could not catch from where they stood. "Don't worry about the dry cleaning, I'll handle it." 5 words, quiet, factual, aimed at no one in particular and at everyone at once, the way a person speaks when they are entirely without fear and they have simply decided something. Diana Reyes held her clipboard to her chest for another 3 seconds after the words landed. Then she lowered it, opened it to a blank page, and wrote the date and the time. She would remember those 5 words longer than she would remember most things that happened in this building. What Victor Hale did not know, what not one of those 4 Westgate Capital investors standing behind him in the marble atrium of the Hale Vertex Tower could have known, was that the woman standing at that reception desk, pressing a folded paper towel to the shoulder of her blazer with the composed patience of someone doing something she has done before, had held 51% of Hale Vertex for 37 months, not 49, not 45. 51, a majority, an instruction, a door, already open, that no one had yet thought to look at, a blade waiting in a drawer that no one had known was there. She had grown up in Flushing, Queens, the daughter of Henry Voss, who cleaned office buildings in Midtown at night and slept until noon and made her breakfast before school with the particular kind of attention that belongs to people who have grown up with very little and have decided to give everything they can to the things that cost nothing. He was a methodical man, not slow, not ponderous, methodical, the kind of person who approached a problem by understanding its perimeter before touching its center. He wore a stainless steel watch on his left wrist, nothing expensive, the kind of watch that comes in its own cardboard box without an outer box, and he checked it with a regularity that was not about anxiety, but about respect for time, a resource that, unlike money, could not be borrowed or earned back once it was spent. Elena had inherited the watch when he died. She had been 31. She wore it every day afterward, left wrist, face up, always wound, because it was his, and because it reminded her of the way he moved through the world, which was without waste and without apology and with a completeness of attention to whatever was in front of him that she had tried to replicate in everything she did since. She put herself through Baruch College on night classes, fitting them around data entry contracts she picked up through a temp agency in Astoria, and 2 years of weekend work for a catering firm that serviced the kinds of corporate events she would later walk past in hotel lobbies without stopping. She was not romantic about the work. It was the work available to her, and she did it well, and she banked what she could, and she took her accounting courses on Tuesday and Thursday evenings in a classroom that smelled like the ventilation system needed maintenance. She graduated in May and took the first solid offer she received, a junior accountant position at a company then called Wren Solutions, in a building 12 blocks south of where Hale Vertex now stood. She was 28 years old. She told no one at Wren Solutions where she had gone to school or how she had paid for it. Not out of shame, and not precisely out of pride either, out of precision. She had learned early with the particular clarity that comes from watching your father be invisible in rooms where his labor was being consumed, that information you give voluntarily becomes currency that other people spend on your behalf without asking you first. So she kept her receipts, as it were. 5 years into her time at Ren Solutions, when the company had grown from a 120-person operation into something approaching 350, she asked to be transferred to reception. Her supervisor at the time, a well-meaning man named Dennis, who had no category for this kind of request, thought it was a demotion, and said so. Elena explained, with the patience she always brought to explaining things she had already decided. The reception desk was the nerve center of the building. Every delivery, every visitor, every access badge request, every piece of meaningful information about who was meeting with whom, and about what and for how long passed through it. She would like to be there. Dennis approved the transfer and assumed, privately, that she had burned out on numbers. What she had done was get into position. Victor Hale had been recruited 4 years ago by the private equity group that had acquired a controlling stake in Ren Solutions and overseen the rebrand to Hale Vertex. He arrived with a reputation for operational efficiency, which in the private equity vocabulary of that period meant something specific. He was very good at identifying which costs were being carried by people who would not fight back, and eliminating them quickly enough that the narrative around the elimination was over before the affected parties had organized a response. His first month at the company, 15 terminations packaged in the board presentation as the removal of legacy dead weight, a phrase that sounded decisive and forward-looking and contained the specific kind of coldness that investors who have grown up speaking the language of efficiency find reassuring rather than alarming. What it actually meant was that 15 people, some of whom had been with the company since its founding and knew where all the decisions that led to the current structure had been made, were gone before they could provide anyone with institutional memory that might complicate the story Victor was building. His method, once the initial restructuring was complete, was subtler, more sustainable. He did not fire people as a first tool after the opening month. He diminished them, specifically and publicly, with witnesses present, and then he offered the diminished person a thread to hold, a lateral reassignment framed as an expanded role, a new title that sounded like a promotion and functioned as a leash, something they could tell their families over dinner that would not require them to explain what had actually happened. The genius of it, if genius is the right word for something so deliberately cruel, was that people who had been given a thread after their public diminishment were not angry. They were grateful. Grateful people are quieter than angry people. Grateful people are also less likely to consult attorneys. He had done it to a junior analyst who mispronounced a client's name during a presentation, stopping the meeting to have the analyst repeat the name correctly twice, and then offering him afterward a move to the operations team, framed as a broadening of his experience. He had done it to the maintenance chief, who had parked in the wrong lot one morning and found himself the subject of an all-hands email about facility protocols that did not name him, but did not need to. He had done it to Lydia twice. Lydia, his personal assistant, a woman with a master's degree in organizational management and $94,000 in student loans she did not like to count, had absorbed both incidents with the fluency of someone who has learned to translate humiliation into something that resembles professionalism so completely that she herself sometimes could not locate the seam between the two. She stayed because she had nowhere else she could currently afford to go, and because Victor had offered her a title revision after the second incident that came with a 6% raise, and because the sunk cost of 4 years is not nothing, even when the 4 years have cost you something else as well. Eleanor had watched all of this from the reception desk for 4 years. She had watched it the way her father had watched the buildings he cleaned, systematically, without sentiment, with the attention of someone who understands that the information available at ground level is often more complete than the information available from higher floors, because the people at ground level are not performing for anyone. She knew Victor's system the way you know a machine you have studied long enough to understand not just what it does, but why it was built. Cruelty is not always chaos. Sometimes it is an operating model. Sometimes it is the most deliberate thing in the room. The cold he left behind him was so consistent, so architecturally embedded in the building's daily temperature, that people had started to dress for it without realizing they were making a choice. Eleanor had never dressed for it. She had always worn the same thing: the uniform, the watch, the flat attention, because the cold was a condition of the building, not a law of the world. And laws of the world are the only ones you cannot change. 11 years ago, before the private equity acquisition, before the rebrand, when the building on 46th Street still carried the name Wren Solutions above its entrance and had 312 employees and a lobby that smelled of the coffee cart that arrived on the second floor every morning at 7:30. James Wren hired Elena Voss as a summer data intern. He was 61 at the time, angular and deliberate, a man built from the specific posture of someone who had earned the right to move slowly because he had already moved quickly enough and long enough to know the difference. He had founded the company in his mid-40s after 20 years in financial analysis, which meant he had spent 2 decades watching other people receive credit for his pattern recognition before he decided to stop watching and start building. He remembered names, not as a management affectation, not as the kind of performative attentiveness that certain executives cultivate to create the impression of warmth while deploying it as leverage. He remembered names because he considered remembering the name of a person who worked for him a basic act of respect, the minimum viable acknowledgement that a person was a person and not an ambient feature of the environment. He remembered Elena's name on her 3rd day, calling it across the 2nd floor corridor without checking a list or pausing to confirm, and she noted it the way she noted everything, quietly, without performance, filing it in the part of her attention that tracked what was true about people rather than what they wanted to appear. He noticed her work the way you notice something that does not belong where it is, not because it is wrong, but because it is a different order of rightness than what surrounds it. She had a quality in her analysis that was difficult to name precisely, an ability to read what a set of numbers was actually doing rather than what it appeared to be doing on the surface, a kind of grammatical fluency with data that went beyond accuracy into something closer to interpretation. He asked her to explain her process once in his office on a Thursday afternoon with the door open and the coffee cart fumes drifting in from the corridor and the city noise rising from the street below, and she explained it simply without decoration, using plain language about the relationship between variance patterns and the assumptions built into the models they were running. He listened without interrupting. He did not ask her to simplify or to speed up or to contextualize her explanation for a person who might not follow her. He listened the way a person listens when they are not waiting for their turn to speak, and afterward he said, "Thank you, that's very clear." 2 sentences. They stayed with her for a long time. They developed, over the 5 years that followed, a relationship that had no clean institutional name and did not need one. She rose, quietly, through the company's data function. He kept watching. There were conversations in his office with the door open, conversations in the corridor, once a conversation in the parking garage on a January evening when he was late and she was leaving, and neither of them had planned it, and both of them had kept talking for 40 minutes anyway. He was not grooming her as a successor in the formal sense. He was watching her become something that the company's org chart had not made a box for yet, and he found this interesting rather than inconvenient, which told her something important about the kind of man he was. James Wren was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of his 66th year. He did not tell the board immediately. He called his estate attorney first, a senior partner at an older midtown firm that had handled his affairs since the company's founding, and they met for 2 hours in the firm's conference room on a Tuesday morning, and James Wren explained what he wanted the company to look like when he was no longer present to see it, with the methodical specificity of a man who had spent his professional life building things he intended to last. The transfer was structured carefully over 2 separate transactions across a period of 4 months, each step reviewed by James's attorney and documented with the kind of thoroughness that James brought to everything he touched. By the time the transfers were complete, the company had already been partially rebranded in preparation for the private equity investment, and the shares involved were in the newly restructured Hale Vertex entity rather than the old Wren Solutions one. James's estate attorney transferred 19% of those shares to WRN Holdings LLC at a valuation that reflected the company's pre-acquisition price, a below-market transaction that was documented, reviewed, and entirely legal, and that attracted no particular attention at the time because it was one of several estate planning moves happening simultaneously. Elena had formed WRN Holdings LLC herself, before the transfer, through a corporate attorney in Brooklyn who had no connection to Wren Solutions and did not need one. The attorney asked her what the company's purpose was, and she said holding company for investment assets, and he filled in the paperwork, and she signed it and took the operating agreement home in a manila folder and put it in the fireproof box under her bed alongside her passport and her father's death certificate and a photograph of Henry Voss in his work uniform, taken in 1987, the year before Elena was born. The board roster, updated quarterly, listed WRN Holdings LLC as a minority shareholder with 19%. Nobody connected the name to the woman at the reception desk. It would not have occurred to anyone to try. In the 6 years that followed James Wren's death, Elena made additional purchases through WRN Holdings. She worked through the secondary market, buying in tranches sized carefully to remain below the 5% threshold that would trigger mandatory public disclosure with each individual acquisition, which meant the accumulation was slow and required attention and patience and the willingness to move in small increments for a very long time before the total was visible. She reached 26% in year 2, 34 in year 4, 44 in year 5, 51 in the spring of her 8th year at the reception desk. She did not celebrate. She sat with it for a week, the way you sit with a door before you make the decision about whether to open it, feeling the weight of the handle in your hand without yet committing to the movement. Why was she still at reception when she could have called the meeting at any point after crossing 49? Because of a promise? In James Wren's last week, when the oxygen was being managed through the apparatus beside his bed and the lucid hours had contracted to something shorter and more precious than they had been, he had said to her, plainly, the way he said everything, "Stay inside the building. Watch it. You will know when." She had watched for 4 years. She had catalogued Victor's system. She had watched the terminations, the public diminishments, the company-wide emails that said one thing while meaning another, the vendor contracts that had begun, under Diana Reyes's careful scrutiny, to accrue anomalies too consistent to be accidental. She had watched the human cost of it. The junior analyst who left the company 6 months after his lateral move with the kind of quietness that speaks louder than any resignation letter. The maintenance chief who had not been the same since, Lydia, whose handwriting in the admin notes had become more careful and more compressed over the course of 4 years. The kind of change in handwriting that happens when a person is carrying something they cannot set down. She now knew. Patience is not passivity. Patience is a form of accumulation. It is what you do with the time, while the thing you are waiting for is assembling itself into the shape it needs to be in order to matter. After the lobby incident, after the investors had been escorted to the elevator and the atrium had resumed its practiced tranquility, Victor Hale called Lydia before the elevator car had reached the 42nd floor. He did not preamble. "Put reception on informal probation," he said. "I want her shift coverage reduced to the point where she decides herself to leave. No paperwork tied to me." Lydia wrote it down. This was her practice, had been her practice for 2.5 years. Not because she planned to use her notes, and not because she was, at the time, building a case. She wrote things down because she was an organized person, and because writing things down was the one form of control available to her inside a working environment where most other forms had been gradually removed. She wrote it in the notebook she kept in the inside pocket of her bag, the one with the black cover that looked like any notebook. And she felt the particular sensation she had been feeling for 2.5 years. The sensation of being a precise instrument being used to do something to another person, without the fiction that she had any meaningful say in the use. She wrote it down. It was a habit that was about to become consequential in ways she could not yet foresee, but that, if she were honest, she had been half hoping for since the second time she had been the recipient of Victor's method rather than its instrument. Victor drafted the company-wide email himself. This was unusual. Internal communications were Lydia's domain by design because Victor understood that there was a layer of insulation available in having a second name attached to any piece of communication he did not want examined too closely later. This one he drafted and sent himself from his own account at 6:43 in the morning before most of the building staff had fully organized themselves for the day. The subject line was clean and administrative. Professional standards at Hale Vertex. The body ran 4 paragraphs about conduct, about the importance of composure in client-facing interactions, about the responsibility all staff carried for representing the company's values in every moment, especially in moments visible to external partners. It did not name Elena Voss. It did not need to name her. Every person who read it at 7:15 in the morning on their phone over coffee understood who it was about and what it meant. Diana Reyes read it in her car in the parking garage. She sat for 3 full minutes after finishing the 4th paragraph, the heat in the car slowly dissipating while she held her phone in both hands and read it a second time, more slowly. Then she went upstairs and opened the folder she had been keeping since Victor's 2nd month. The one that lived in the back of the 3rd drawer of her filing cabinet behind the compliance reports, and she added a printed copy of the email with the date and time handwritten at the top. Eleanor received the HR form at her desk at 9:15, hand-delivered by a junior member of Diana's team named Carrie, who had been asked to deliver it in person and who arrived at the reception desk with the specific expression of someone who has been asked to do something they find distasteful but cannot decline without consequences. The form was a written warning and a reduced hours notice combined into a single document, formatted on official letterhead, her shift structure being reduced from 5 days to 3 pending a performance review, described in the document as a temporary operational adjustment. Elena read it once. She read it the way she read everything, without haste, without visible movement in her face, taking in the language at the pace of the language rather than the pace of her reaction to it. Then she set it face down on the desk, not crumpled, not tucked away. Face down, centered, corners parallel to the desk edge. Then she picked up her phone. The call to Marcus Webb, her corporate attorney, lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. She had the time because she had checked it afterward, out of the same habit her father had, the habit of knowing how time had been spent. During those 4 minutes and 11 seconds, Marcus Webb said, "Elena, what happened?" She gave him the date, the time, the triggering event, the number of investors present, and their firm affiliation. She confirmed the agenda item she had prepared. She gave him the meeting date she wanted and the rule number under the corporate charter she was invoking. Marcus Webb said, "I will file the notice today," he said. "You have been extraordinarily patient," she said. "I know." She set the phone on the desk beside the face-down HR form. The trap was closed, and the person who had closed it was the same person who had set it. He simply did not know either of those things yet. Victor ordered the Brioni replacement jacket that afternoon, 2-day express delivery, charged to the corporate card under the line item he had created for executive wardrobe maintenance, which was a line item whose existence he had never felt the need to explain to anyone who asked about it, because no one had ever asked. He spent the following 2 days in the kind of focused confidence that belongs to a person preparing for a performance they are certain of. The Westgate Capital pitch deck reached 43 pages by the final version, with growth projections built out through the end of 2031, curves that required a particular reading of the last 2 years' vendor contract structure to appear as clean as they appeared on the screen. He sent a message to Paul Mercer, his contact at Capital Review, noting that the company's Q3 was going to be, he used this exact word, transformative. He expected Paul to call. Paul had always called. He was, in these 2 days, entirely untroubled. Nothing in the building reached him that suggested trouble. No one came to his office with a concern. Lydia brought him his coffee at the same time she always did, and answered his questions with the same competent neutrality she always deployed, and said nothing about a lawyer filing anything anywhere. He was confident in the way that a man who has never been wrong inside a particular system becomes confident by confusing the system's tolerance of him for its endorsement. Elena did not change anything about her mornings. She arrived at the time she always arrived, coming up from the lower garage and crossing the lobby with her coat still on and her bag on her left shoulder, and she said good morning to the same people in the same order she had for 8 years. She wore the same uniform. She did not speak to anyone about the HR form or the reduced hours or the company-wide email or the meeting Marcus had filed. She did not appear distracted. She did not appear coiled or watchful or tense in the particular way that people who are waiting for something tend to appear. She appeared, to anyone who looked, exactly as she had always appeared. Present, competent, unhurried, the specific quality of composed attention that had made her the person in the building who everyone eventually told things to without quite knowing why. But the building was doing something she had earned over 8 years without designing it as a strategy. She had not cultivated the building's loyalty because she expected to need it. She had simply treated every person in the building as a person rather than as a feature of the environment. And the building had become, over time, a place where she was known in the particular way that matters most, known to be real. The maintenance supervisor, Eddie, greeted her in the lower garage on Tuesday morning. He had his cart between 2 pillars, and he looked up when he heard her footsteps. "Good morning, Miss Voss." Not Elena, not the casual wave of a coworker. Miss Voss with the slight formality of someone who has decided without being told to that the correct register for this person is one step above the casual because the casual no longer feels sufficient. Theo Bauer held the elevator an extra 10 seconds when he saw her coming across the lobby from the far entrance on Wednesday, still in her coat, the morning cold still in the fabric of it, bag on her left shoulder. He pressed the door open button and held it without saying anything, and she crossed the lobby and stepped in, and he released the button, and neither of them made anything of it. It was just a door held open, which was all it needed to be. Luce, who cleaned the executive floor, brought Elena a coffee on Wednesday morning, appearing at the reception desk without having been asked or scheduled. She set it carefully on the far corner, where the desk surface was clear. "It looked cold last time," she said, and did not stay to explain further, because she did not need to explain further. Elena thanked her and drank it. The confirmation email from Carol, the board secretary, arrived on Thursday afternoon at 4:57 in Carol's administrative flat affect format that she applied equally to all correspondence, from the most routine scheduling notice to the most consequential organizational communication. Special meeting of shareholders confirmed. 10 a.m. 47th floor conference room. Agenda, majority shareholder request, per Rule 12 of the corporate charter. Carol had formatted it correctly. She had not asked any questions about who had made the request, or what Rule 12 governed, or why a shareholder was invoking a procedure that the building had not seen used in its current form in 6 years. Her role was to confirm the meeting, and she had confirmed it, and she had moved on to the next item on her list with the equanimity of a person who has worked in this building long enough to understand that the meeting she is asked to confirm occasionally contain surprises that are not her surprises to manage. Power and noise are different things. They can coexist, and they often do, but they are not the same, and the error of confusing one for the other belongs almost exclusively to the person who has confused them. Victor Hale had been making that error for 4 years. The error was about to be corrected. 3 days after the lobby, the glass and marble lobby of the Hale Vertex Tower in the morning of a Tuesday in Midtown Manhattan, the city doing what it always does in the morning, which is move, with the specific density of movement that belongs to streets where every person is going somewhere that matters to them, even if it matters to no one else. Victor arrived at the building at 9:45, which was early for a man who generally preferred to enter a room after it had oriented itself toward his arrival. But the Westgate meeting was the most consequential thing on his calendar, since the Series C close and early felt like the correct choice for the day. He straightened his jacket in the lobby mirror, the new jacket, 2-day delivery, exactly as he had requested. He greeted the security officer at the desk by name, which he always did in front of visitors. He made a small remark about the morning weather that fell inside the elevator and was gone before the doors opened on the 47th floor. Margot Sinclair arrived at 9:50 with her 2 colleagues and her partner from Westgate, a tall, quiet man named Gerald, who had been with the firm for 30 years and who communicated almost entirely in the register of implication. Victor greeted Margot with both hands, the warmth he reserved for people whose commitment he needed, and she received it with the same measured courtesy she had shown him at each of their prior meetings, which was the same courtesy she showed everyone and which told him again and incorrectly that she was pleased. His attorney, a senior partner from a firm whose name was on 4 of the company's founding documents, arrived at 9:58 and took his position 2 steps behind Victor's right shoulder with the practiced invisibility of a man who has been performing this function for other powerful men for 30 years. The 47th floor conference room was the crown of the building. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, a table that seated 22, the kind of room that was designed to make people feel the weight of the space and mistake it for the weight of the institution. The board secretary, Carol, was seated at the far end of the table with her laptop open. The Westgate team arranged themselves on one side. Victor's board appointees, 2 men who had been with the company since the PE acquisition and who had spent the past 18 months with the specific discomfort of knowing something they had not yet decided what to do about, stood near the credenza. Roger Strauss, the COO, was by the window with a coffee cup he was not drinking from. The room was assembled, complete, properly oriented toward the meeting Victor had designed for this morning. The chime of the elevator, a single clean tone from the bank that served the executive floors and required a badge scan at the keypad, came at 10:02. The sound was identical to the sound it made every time the elevator opened, which was many times a day, which was why no one reacted to the sound itself. They reacted to what followed it. Elena Voss stepped out of the elevator. She was not wearing the receptionist blazer, she was wearing a suit, dark charcoal, the same shade as the uniform she wore at the desk, which may or may not have been a choice, but which had the effect of making her look like herself and something else at the same time. The continuity visible, the change also visible, both things true simultaneously. The suit was structured and entirely unadorned, no visible brand, no earrings, no necklace, no rings. On her left wrist, her father's stainless steel watch, face up as always, as it had always been every morning for 8 years at the desk, and every evening after. She crossed from the elevator toward the conference room with her posture exactly as it always was, straight, unhurried, the specific quality of contained movement that belongs to a person who does not need the room to rearrange itself around her arrival because she already knows where she is going and has already decided what she will do when she gets there. She did not look around. She did not adjust her pace for the room. She walked in. The silence that followed her entrance through the conference room door did not fall all at once. It moved in sequence, the way silence in rooms like this always moves, the way it moved in every story ever told about the moment a room understood something it had not understood before. The board secretary, Carol, stopped typing first, mid-word, her fingers stealing on the keyboard without any apparent decision to stop. The paralegal beside her looked up. Roger Strauss turned from the window, his coffee cup still raised and going no further. The 2 board appointees in the corner exchanged a look with a question in it that neither of them spoke. The Westgate team, who did not know Elena Voss and had no context for what they were seeing, read the room's reaction and went still, the way attentive people go still when something is happening that they cannot yet name. Margot Sinclair was seated at the table. She did not turn. She did not stand. She did not move in any visible way, but her pen, which had been making small, precise marks in the margin of her notepad, stopped making them. Victor Hale was at the head of the table, or rather, at the position he had been occupying as the head of the table, which was the position he had occupied in every meeting in this room for 4 years. He looked at Elena crossing toward the table. His expression performed control with great precision. "What is she doing here?" He did not phrase it as a question. He phrased it as a statement of incomprehension that contained, if you listened for it, the faintest edge of something that was not quite alarm, but was moving toward it from a short distance. No one answered him, not Lydia, who was standing outside the glass partition in her usual position, her notebook in her hands, watching through the glass. Not Roger, who had set his coffee cup down on the windowsill and was not looking at Victor. Not the board appointees, who were still looking at each other. Victor's attorney leaned over and said something close to Victor's ear, a single sentence, brief and low. Victor received it. He read the meaning on his attorney's face before the sentence was fully finished, which is not the same thing as understanding it, but it was enough to tell him that the attorney was not going to be the solution. He turned back to Elena. Elena had crossed to the seat at the head of the table. Not a seat along the side, not a chair near the door. The seat at the head of the table, the one without a nameplate in front of it, because the seat at the head of the table did not require a nameplate to make its position legible. She pulled the chair out with 2 hands and sat down, and she placed her hands flat on the surface of the table in front of her. The same placement, the same posture, as the hands flat on the desk in the lobby every morning. The room held itself. No one spoke. The temperature in the room had not changed in any measurable way. Every person in it felt it change. Victor Hale had built his professional identity on the ability to reframe whatever was in front of him before anyone else in the room had time to name it on their own terms. This was his actual skill, the substrate beneath the gestures and the tours and the well-calibrated pauses, the ability to place his interpretation over a situation the way you lay a transparency over a map, so that people saw his version first and spent the remainder of the conversation reconciling their observations with his framing rather than building their own. He was very good at this. He had been doing it for 4 years in this room with these people, and it had worked every time. He tried it now. "I don't know what this is," he said, and his voice was controlled and measured and contained exactly the right amount of tolerant confusion. "But this meeting is for shareholders." Elena looked at him. She said, "I know, I called it." The sentence was 9 words. She did not add anything to it. She did not soften it or explain it or bridge it toward a more comfortable register. She let it sit in the room in its full simplicity and allowed it to mean what it meant. Victor looked at his attorney, who gave him the smallest and least useful nod. Then Victor said, formally, with the precision of a man buying time by performing process, "I would like to see the shareholder register." It was produced. Carol had prepared the documents in advance because Carol always prepared the documents in advance, and she set the relevant pages on the table in front of Victor, with the flat efficiency of someone who had organized this meeting herself and understood its purpose. Victor read the shareholder register with the concentration of a man who is still, even now, not quite certain of what he is looking for, because the possibility had lived in him only as abstraction, the kind of risk you catalogue without believing in it, the kind of thing that happens to other people in other companies, in other rooms than yours. He found it on the 3rd page. WRN Holdings, LLC. 51%. He read it twice. He looked up. He looked at Elena, who was looking at the document in front of her, not at him. He looked back at the register and read it a 3rd time, more slowly than the first 2 combined. The way people read things when they are trying to find the version of the sentence that means something different from what it appears to mean. Then he said, at a volume that was closer to private thought than public statement, as if the room had contracted to just the 2 of them, "Who is WRN Holdings?" Carol set a second document on the table in front of him. It was a corporate registration form, the kind of document filed with the state when an LLC is organized, routine in its formatting and its language, entirely unambiguous in its content. On the line that read "Beneficial Owner" in the same flat administrative typeface as every other line on the form, Elena M. Voss. Victor looked at it for a long time. The room gave him the time. No one spoke. No one shifted. Outside the glass, Lydia was still, her notebook open to a blank page. Inside the room, the Westgate team was doing what experienced investors do when a room contains information they have not processed yet, waiting, watching, holding their assessments where they could not be read. Victor said, "You can't be." He stopped. The sentence had no ending that served him. Elena waited 2 beats. Then she said, "You mistook a uniform for a ceiling. They are not the same thing." Victor's attorney was making a note. Margot Sinclair's pen had begun to move. Victor tried the next angle with the efficiency of a man who is running through options in the order they are available to him. Her employment agreement, he said. Her position as a member of the company's staff created a conflict of interest with her role as a controlling shareholder, and his legal team would be examining whether that constituted a breach of her employment terms that could affect the validity of the shareholding. Elena listened to this with her hands flat on the table and her posture unchanged. She said, I have attended every board meeting for 6 years, from the lobby with the visitor log. The meeting minutes were distributed to all registered shareholders by email. I have the complete records. Victor shifted in his chair, a small motion, the first uncontrolled physical movement he had made since she sat down. He tried minimizing next. The second tool after the first fails, which was the suggestion that she was technically capable but operationally unqualified, that running a company at this level and at this scale required a particular kind of experience that a decade spent at a reception desk simply did not, no matter how well-intentioned, provide. Elena listened to this version with the same attention she had given the first. Her face remained exactly as it was. Her hands remained flat on the table. Then she said, "The coffee, by the way, a little cold, but I've had worse." The sentence landed in silence that was unlike the silence of the previous minutes. It was the silence of 12 people in a room simultaneously understanding that the dynamic they have been operating inside of has been replaced by a different one, and that the replacement did not happen in this room or this morning, but a long time ago. And they are only now being informed of it, the way you are sometimes only now informed of a fact that was true while you were not looking. Margot Sinclair wrote something in her notepad. Her Westgate partner exhaled slowly, a single quiet breath, the kind a person releases when they have recalculated something and the new figure has settled into the body. Victor tried one more register. Negotiation, which was the third tool and also the last. He would give her a seat on the board, a formal role, an acknowledgement, a structure in which her shareholding could be recognized without disrupting the operational continuity that the Westgate relationship depended on. He said it with something approaching sincerity because by this point he understood that the negotiation was not for the company's benefit or for hers. It was for his. Elena opened the agenda packet that had been placed in front of her. She did not answer the offer. She turned to the first page. There is a difference between understanding something and being ready for what understanding it means. Victor Hale had understood in this moment what had been done and how it had been done and by whom. What he was not ready for was the next 10 minutes. Elena smoothed the first page of the agenda packet with 2 fingers. A small motion, deliberate, the kind of gesture that functions as a transition. Whatever has been happening in this room is now finished, and what begins now is something different. She had prepared 3 items. She presented them in the order they appeared in the packet, without preface, without rhetorical elevation, in the same clear register she used for everything she said at a desk or in a room where someone needed something from her, which was the register of someone who has already done the thinking and is now only transmitting the result. The first item was the removal of Victor Hale as Chief Executive Officer of Hale Vertex, effective at the close of business today, Tuesday, with transition protocols to be defined by the interim committee pending completion of a formal separation agreement. The second item was the appointment of a 3-person transition executive committee, with interim operational authority distributed across existing senior leadership, excluding board appointees with outstanding exposure to the vendor contract structure that would be subject to audit, pending the completion of a national search for a permanent chief executive. The third item was the commissioning of a comprehensive internal financial audit, scope covering all vendor contracts entered into during Victor's 4-year tenure, all board compensation structures established or modified during that period, and all public relations and event expenditure approvals made under Victor's direct authority. She did not editorialize any of the 3 items. She simply stated them in sequence and waited. Victor said, "I built this company." He said it the way people say things that have been the foundation of their self-narrative for so long that the statement functions as a reflex rather than a claim. Something that precedes the decision to speak rather than following it. Elena said, "James Wren built this company. I just kept my word to him." The vote was not a deliberation. A 51% majority is not a close vote. It is not a vote at all, in the sense that involves uncertainty about the outcome. It is a procedural formality that ratifies a decision already made by the structure of the ownership. The two board appointees Victor had placed himself, men who had attended the dinners at which certain vendor contract arrangements had been discussed, and who had spent the last 18 months carrying the specific weight of knowing something they had not yet decided what to do about, abstained. They did not vote against him, but they did not vote for him either, and in the context of a 51% majority, the distinction between those two things was purely personal rather than practical. The vote passed. Margot Sinclair spoke after Carol recorded the vote in the minutes. She spoke in the measured register of a professional delivering information as information without performance. Westgate Capital, she said, would be placing its $200 million investment commitment on hold, effective immediately, pending the preliminary findings of the internal financial audit. She said her firm had considerable patience when the underlying asset was structurally sound, and that she had reason to believe it was. She did not look at Victor when she said any of this. She looked at the agenda packet. She looked at Elena. She did not write anything in her notepad during this speech. Victor did not stand. The room reorganized itself around the new operational reality with the specific efficiency of rooms in which people have been waiting for permission to reorganize. Carol began the formal minutes for the record. The Westgate team conferred quietly in the corner. The two board appointees moved away from the credenza and toward the table and the agenda packet in a way that signaled a shift in operational orientation that did not require words. Roger Strauss picked up his coffee cup, remembered he had not been drinking it, set it down again. Outside the glass, Lydia had heard the vote through the partition. She stood very still afterward for a moment that had no particular length, and then she allowed herself one breath. Long, quiet, the kind of breath that has been held for longer than any single moment, and that releases the weight of that duration in the releasing. His COO did not call back. Victor sent a second message at 2:15 and a third at 4:30, and Roger Strauss did not respond to any of them. At 6 p.m., Roger submitted his resignation to Carol's inbox via email. The subject line was "Resignation effective immediately." The body was 2 sentences about pursuing other opportunities and expressing gratitude for the experience gained, the 2 sentences that function in professional correspondence as the absolute minimum required to close a door without leaving it completely open, because Roger Strauss had spent enough of his career around attorneys to know the difference. Paul Mercer, the journalist at Capital Review who had written 3 favorable profiles of Hale Vertex in the previous 2 years, and who had received Victor's message about the transformative Q3 at 10:45 in the morning, did not respond to the message. He did not respond to the follow-up call at 2 in the afternoon. He did not respond to the second follow-up at 4. The silence from that direction was the particular silence of a person who has received a calculation from one party and received new information from another party and has quietly decided which version of the story is the one they will not be associating their name with. The story would appear eventually in the financial ledger, which was not Paul's publication, and it would be about the audit rather than the transformative Q3. Lydia's email arrived at 4:52 before she had collected her bag from her desk or turned off her monitor. It was addressed to the Transition Committee's newly created inbox, which Carol had set up at 12:45 p.m. The subject line was documentation. The body was 3 sentences. She had maintained a personal record of certain verbal instructions she had received during her employment. She wished to make those records available to the audit committee at their convenience, and she was available to speak in person or in writing at any time that worked for them. She pressed send. She sat for a moment at her desk, with her hands in her lap, the office quiet around her in the specific way offices go quiet on an afternoon when something significant has happened and the building has not yet decided how to carry the weight of it. She felt sitting there something she recognized from a time before this job, before the loans and before the 2 incidents and before the notebook she had kept, because she could not stop herself from keeping it. The particular release of no longer holding something that was never yours to carry. Victor was in the boardroom at 11:34 at night. He did not know how he had come to be there, not precisely, not in the sense of remembering the decision to return and the elevator and the badge scan and the chair. He had come back for something, a file perhaps, a jacket from the coat rack by the credenza. some object whose specific identity had dissolved in the hours since the vote. He had sat down, and the sitting had extended into an hour and then another, and now the city was the way it is at 11:30 in Midtown, never entirely still, the grid of it lit from below and above, taxis and the few remaining pedestrians, and the lights of other buildings where other people were still in their offices for their own reasons or no reason. The cleaning crew arrived at their scheduled time. 2 people, a cart, badges clipped, the professional quiet of people who have learned to work around whatever is present in a space without requiring it to explain itself or move or account for its presence. They moved around Victor with the same efficient courtesy they would have extended to any piece of furniture that had not been there last Tuesday and might not be here next Tuesday. He did not speak. He watched the city. He replayed the lobby the way you replay the moment just before a car accident, with the specific useless clarity of total recall that arrives after the fact and contains everything except the ability to change anything. The coffee cup, the second cup in his hand, her face, the paper towel she had produced without looking down, the 5 words to Diana. He thought, why did she not simply say something? 4 years of watching and never a word, never a signal. Why, he already knew the answer. He had known it the moment she sat at the head of the table with her father's watch on her wrist and her hands flat on the surface and her posture exactly the same as it always was, as it had always been, the posture of someone who has not been waiting to arrive anywhere because she has always already known exactly where she is, because she had not needed to say anything, because saying something was never the point. Because the point was always the 51% and the 37 months and the promise she had kept to a dead man who had remembered her name in a corridor on a Tuesday and meant it. Eleanor stood at the window of James Wren's old corner office, which was now hers, though she had not changed the furniture yet. It was not the night for changing furniture. The city was below her, the density of it, the light of it, the specific irreducible fact of Manhattan at night, which is that it does not reduce, it does not simplify, it simply continues in its enormity regardless of what has happened inside any particular building. Her father's watch was in her left palm, not on her wrist. In her palm, face up, the way you hold something when you want to feel its weight, when you want the physical reality of an object to remind you that some things pass from one set of hands to another, and the passing is both a form of love and a form of instruction. And the two are inseparable in ways that only become clear much later, when you are standing at a window with the object in your hand and the thing you were instructed toward is no longer something you are waiting for. She did not think about Victor. She thought about James Wren and a corridor on a Tuesday and a man who listened without waiting for his turn to speak and who had said, in a room with an oxygen apparatus and shorter lucid hours, "Stay inside the building, watch it, you will know when." Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it stands at a reception desk for 8 years waiting for someone arrogant enough to make the reason obvious.